Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Live on Air this Sunday evening. It's my very great privilege to have Professor Peter Lineham with me this evening. Peter is Professor of History and does numerous other things within Massey University here at the Albany campus in Auckland. Peter, would you like to begin by telling us just a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you ended up in the subject of history as one of New Zealand's foremost historians?
Thank you. So I was born in Karamea on the west coast of the South Island, in a very isolated spot, I guess it really is, given that I hardly ever go back there. It's just too hard to get to and from there. And so for the first 12 years, I'm one of 5 boys. Now, Karamea is a very isolated place, and its religious spread is pretty unusual. There's a little Anglican Church of the Holy Trinity, which, at least when I was there, on alternate Sunday mornings and evenings, services were held, or perhaps Sunday evenings, services were held by either the Anglican or the Presbyterian ministers coming from Granity, about 50 miles south. The Sunday school, which was held in the Anglican Church, was run by the Open Brethren, the Jennings family and the Garlick family, and heavily attended by our family. And then there was a very strong Brethren tradition that went back to the 1890s in Karamea. And we were part of a group that had split away from the exclusive Brethren in 1919 and had affiliated with a group which we called the Reading Brethren, but were, from the points of view of others, often called the Stuart or Kelly Low division, which went back to a split in the exclusive Brethren in the 1880s. And so we met in a little hall opposite my grandmother's farm, every Sunday morning and mid-afternoon, but we participated in that district. Basically everybody cooperated except the Catholics. And the Catholics didn't have their own school, so there was some cooperation, and my best friend was a Catholic. But we largely supported the Open Brethren, and when there was visiting preachers from whatever denomination, we all went, and we'd regularly go to the Anglican or Presbyterian services at night. And of course, things like that happened in small country districts, which didn't happen in larger towns. And a lot of that has shaped me quite profoundly, because I've always been a person who's had a contact with a range of different denominations.
Just as a sort of a sideline curious question, the distinction between Roman Catholic and Protestant was very marked in the West Coast and in the Southland, and possibly Otago in the early stages of New Zealand colonial history. So some of that still carried over into Karamea at that time?
It certainly did in Westport. If you went to Westport, O'Connor and the presence of Catholic institutions was very apparent and very strong. And there were some pretty sharp denominational lines drawn in the mining towns of Millerton and Stockton and Denniston, which we passed to go into Westport, which was our big town, believe it or not. In Karamea, though, it was a country district, a rural district, so there were no miners. So basically, because everybody was farmers, there was quite a different relationship. And the priest only came out, I don't think it was every week they held services. And so the Catholic members of the community went to the state school, in primary school. They went elsewhere for secondary education. And so I can recall as a boy going to my friend Joseph's place for lunch or dinner or something, and being not quite sure about all this idolatrous stuff of this Latin grace that was said, but we were good friends. And when my family, because I've got 4 brothers, and my father and mother, dad ran the local he had a small contracting business picking up the cream from the farmers and picking up coal and wood and bringing it to people for the keep their fires going, and so he couldn't afford to send us all to boarding school. So in 1965, the family moved to Christchurch, pretty regretfully from my father's point of view, in order to ensure that the 5 boys, could get a decent education. And at that point, say, Joseph went to St. Bede's College, and so we kept up contact there. But yes, the world of Christchurch was extraordinarily different from the world of Karamea. So I'll tell you a bit more about.
I was just going to say that shift is sort of like a change of universe in some ways, isn't it? To go from one of the most isolated spots at the top of New Zealand's South Island to its most populous city. Yeah, that's quite a mind-blowing event.
You understand that for me, it was the most wonderful thing that had ever happened in my life. My mother was from Timaru, and much of her family was in Christchurch, and our holidays had always been in Christchurch. And for me, you know, Christchurch was the only hope for the universe, really. There was Karamea, certainly wasn't it, and a small country school for all of our family, emphasis on education. Christian child had wanted to go to uh, university or become a teacher, and she'd missed out. And so we had inherited from her a deep, deep love of education, and a feeling of total frustration in the Karamea District High School, which lay ahead of us with its 2 teachers. It was not a hopeful prospect. So to go to Burnside High School in Christchurch, where my mum knew it was a new school, my mum knew the principal, good brethren person, open brethren. This was, like a dream come true. And so in 1965, I began and won a place, to the great pride of the Karamea District High School headmaster, got a place in the top professional class. So I was going to be learning French and Latin. And I mean, I of course reveled in a new secondary school, and I was a prefect, and I was the head librarian, and very involved in the choir and the orchestra and things like that. And so were all of my brothers. And it was fantastically exciting. Now, so we were still Reading Brethren, and the strongest Reading Brethren church in New Zealand, there aren't that many of them, was in Christchurch. And there were very distinctly 2 tensions pulling in that group. One of a connect with other Christians kind, which my mother's family had strong connections with, and the other, the sort of instinctive, exclusive brethren style of you shouldn't contact to other Christians, they pollute you. And we were pretty firmly pushed in the positive line, and every now and then came up hard against the narrow line. And I'm afraid I was clever enough to make life misery for the Bible class teacher at the church, because I kept pushing. I read widely, and through the Crusader movement and through other connections, like, for example, my best friend there at Burnside was Malcolm Glennie, whose father was Don Glennie, very well-known liberal Presbyterian minister.
Yes.
And I would, and I'm the sort of person who has big conversations with everybody. So I could make life pretty miserable for anybody who was trying to teach me a kind of narrow typological interpretation of the scriptures, which I think at least one of your listeners knows what I'm talking about.
Yes. Well, you must be referring to Mr. Mannins. You would know Stuart, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Yes.
Of course.
from Christchurch and Burnside High School, you learnt your French and Latin, but you must have developed an early affiliation for the subject of history.
Yes, well, you might think so. And in a way, I did from a very fine teacher, Derek Wood, who later went on, became a principal in Lower Hutt, I think, and very highly regarded and teacher. But I'd have to say that most of the teachers that taught me history were not great at history. And some of them took the approach of, fact regurgitation, which was not what I was interested in. And so I was actually much more interested in English literature at this stage. I was totally caught up in Bronte and Dickens, and I lived in the world of Bronte and Dickens, to be honest. And so when I went to university at Canterbury, you understand that given my background, the careers advisors thought I really should do religious studies and get involved in the study of religion, but it just wasn't kind of wise in this, or wouldn't have been approved of, would have caused anxiety. So I did a double major in English and history. And at the end of my BA, I really had equal marks in English and history, and pretty good marks. And then had to decide, and then I discovered that you had to learn yet another language, Old English, to do English, whereas I'd also done very well in mathematics. And there seemed just a little hope of using mathematics in history, but very little use possibility in English. So I did a masterate in history and did my MA thesis, really trapped in the vision of Charles Dickens, and exploring the history of imprisonment for debt, which is one of the themes of some of Dickens' novels. That world that he reflects of the hard, tough world of Victorian London. And so I was able to use my mathematics to work and see whether his picture was in fact a true picture. And so I did my masterate thesis, finished it, got an excellent mark, and then applied for and won firstly a New Zealand tenured PhD scholarship. But then, much to my surprise, in May of the year 1975, I won an overseas scholarship. I won the fairly coveted Commonwealth scholarship to England. So I was one of four of us who headed off from New Zealand in October 1975 to go to England to do my PhD. And I'd chosen to go to the University of Sussex because one of the foremost historians of Victorian England, John Harrison, and some others who were quite well known, were based at Sussex. And I suspect I helped my chances by choosing not Oxford or Cambridge, but a new university. And also, I think I greatly enjoyed it more because I had friends who went to Oxford and Cambridge, and the formality and the rigidity of that traditional form of education, I don't think anybody finds easy to do a PhD, whereas it was much more of a community at Sussex. So I had 3 fantastic years doing my PhD. I wanted to do it on Methodism because I'd learned from John Cookson how crucial the Methodist revival was in reshaping England of the 18th century. When I got to England, my thesis supervisor, John Harrison, said he was bored with Methodism and he had 2 students doing things on Methodism. And he had this great little subject up his sleeve of the Swedenborgians. This is the followers of connected with William Blake. William Blake was an early Swedenborgian for the brief period that he was anything. He was then, did his own religious thinking. And so the chance to think in the context of Blake just delighted me. And so I explored a very arcane world of the Swedish 18th century writer who had tried to produce his own enlightenment. He'd rejected the tenets of the Enlightenment and tried to create a world where there'd be some kind of spiritual theory you could draw from the scriptures if only you could find a way to reinterpret it using some kind of analogies And so he produced a theory of interpreting scripture, which ended up appealing very greatly to people who were fed up with Methodism and John Wesley and wanted to think for themselves. And especially the weaving population of Lancashire, this was a very popular movement in late 18th century England, even though, I mean, it ran out of steam fairly soon after that. So I did my PhD on this remote subject.
Right. Did it had some influence, didn't it, on some of the um, leading scientists of the 18th, 19th century? I'm thinking of, I think it was Joseph Priestley may well have had some
Joseph
association.
Priest, well read, David. You are absolutely correct. Joseph Priestley uh, detested Swedenborgianism and actually worked out much of his theory of empirical science in one of his early books. Was an attack on the Swedenborgians, which had resulted from a debate from the Swedenborgians when they'd arrived in Birmingham. This is in the brief period before his church was burnt down by the Church and King mobs in 1793, and he fled to America. So Priestley was quite interested. Others who were interested, the James family had connections, and quite a number of Quakers, Cookworthy and the sculptor Flaxman, were very influenced by Swedenborg. There was a kind of network of people who really were trying to make a bridge between evangelicalism and mysticism. And the theories of Swedenborg gave them a nice bridge into this religious exploration.
Well, I think a lot of Brethren, Presbyterians, Anglicans, Methodists today would be surprised to learn that Swedenborg still has quite a profound influence. Uh, and you find expressions of his way of thinking, his philosophy, even today. Mm. And it also just raised the point when you wrote your MA thesis on in the period of Dickens, and I'm recalling that Dickens, in one of his novels, I think, made a big play about the British Mud Fog Association for the Advancement of Everything, which, if my memory serves me correctly, was his attack on the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And he was particularly, he hated what was emerging as a science of statistics. And so it's fascinating. I didn't know that you had that interest in mathematics, but I mean, there is I think for those that are listening to the development of your understanding of history, that they may not be aware that history has component subject areas that are quite specialist. For example, the history of mathematics, or the history of science, or the history of art, and each of those becomes a major discipline, a major edifice in its own right. But the kind of history that you're talking about has, I think, a flavour of what would it be described as social history, and therefore as trying to embrace theories of society and community and so on and so forth. Or am I on the wrong track there, Peter? Where did you end up?
Okay, so you're completely on the right track. I was trained by the foremost non-Marxist social historian of England. The Marxists were very dominant in the world of social history at this period. John Harrison was very interested in the thinking of Robert Owen, but was not a Marxist. But all his mates were Marxists, and he was certainly on the left. And I was sent off because I was John Harrison's student who was interested in Blake. And at this point, Edward Thompson was working, because Edward Thompson's interest in history came and went a bit. So this is the very prominent Marxist historian who had inspired many people. So I was sent off to spend a bit of time with E.P. Thompson. And I had a very hilarious weekend staying with him, talking through Blake with him. Um, and I've always, had quite I've had a real soft spot for the Thompson family, having known them a bit, um, and also knew some of the others like Hobsbawm. And so I've always, from that, been forced, having come out of a world in New Zealand where historians didn't have to wrestle with social theory. I mean, doubtless sociologists did, but suddenly I discovered history did have to wrestle with that. And so this boy from the sticks had to work pretty hard in thinking through, how do we understand our discipline, and what sense do we give of the shaping or the trajectory of history? Where is history going? And by what means do we write about a society? Because society is not just a potted set of biographies. It's got to be movements, it's got to be forces, it's got to be changes in the standard of living. And that debate was at the heart of the Marxist, non-Marxist discussions going on in England, where the whole question of, could the standard of living rise, and yet the workers still feel denied in their sense of identity and struggling with their purpose and shape. And so those were really fascinating issues which have kept me very deeply on the issue of the nature of history.
Well, I think what has happened, Peter, is that as in those formative years where you're starting to accumulate all the tools and techniques and the trade of writing history, you then came back to New Zealand and started lecturing at Massey in Palmerston North, which was the centre of something quite new at the time that you got started. And I'm thinking here of Brian Collis and the Religious Studies Department, or was it combined with philosophy? I can't remember. But for people like me who were beginning Methodist clergy, and there were quite a group of us then, we were suddenly confronted with historians, young historians like Peter Lineham, coming in and telling us about New Zealand missionaries and implications of the treaty and all kinds of interesting things that perhaps we'd not quite heard in the same way. And so I wonder if you could tell us, please, a little bit about what are the fascinating things you've done in writing and researching history since the early days in Palmerston North?
Yes, so I was very fortunate to get a position at Massey University. And of course, the forces for me were none of the forces that you're talking about. The small religious studies department had been founded actually with an interesting story. Methodism and the Manawatu, can play an important role both in the beginnings of religious studies and in the beginning of social work at Massey University and in New Zealand, really. But for me, the critical factor was Bill Oliver, that remarkable and astute historian, again, with strong connections to the left, well read in some of the stuff that I was interested in, though much more focusing on New Zealand history by that period, and also his colleague and the first appointee in the history department, in fact, John Owens, who had written his thesis on the first Methodist missionaries in New Zealand. So I came into the department at Massey, where, of course, we taught predominantly, all the subjects were taught extramurally. Our largest classes were extramural classes. And I was so very fortunate to inherit initially the course on English social history, which I took over, which had originally been Bill Oliver's and had gone through, a couple of others had taught it before I got it, and then was able to start the teaching of New Zealand religious history, which then the religious studies people used as part of the religious studies degree as well as being part of the history degree. And that course I'm starting teaching for the year tomorrow. I'm still teaching it. It's developed a bit. So then I set to work because I realized actually it's I had to make a big choice when I accepted the Massey position. I chose not to advance my work in British history, but to transfer to this almost empty field of New Zealand religious history, where really the only person who had done much at that stage, though of course what he had done was so extraordinary, was the professor at Knox College, Ian Brewer. But his was very strongly a Presbyterian history, though he knew a lot more. And I'd nearly done a PhD under his supervision right back before I got the Commonwealth Scholarship. So it was quite natural. And meanwhile, I had written the history of the Brethren in a sort of a gap that I had had before going overseas. So I already had a book to my name. And no sooner did I get back than I was invited to write the history of Scripture Union, which is a youth movement with strong emphasis on Bible study tools and the like. And I did that in my first year that I was at Massey. And that was a really fun thing to do, which gave me a lot of understanding about the evangelical world. And so I increasingly began to carve out this field of New Zealand religious history. And then in 1987, my very dear friend and colleague, Alan Davidson, had come back to New Zealand and been appointed at St. John's College. And we began collaboration and cooperation. And really, we've never looked back since. Even though Alan is older than me and has retired, I mean, we're still collaborating on this, that, or the other, and we're friendly colleagues and critics of each other's work. And between us, I guess, New Zealand religious history has just boomed. And there's been such fantastic work now in most of the universities, and there's been some pretty wonderful links back to that early work in the 1980s.
Yes,
Meanwhile,
three of you,
yeah,
beginning with Ian Brewer and then yourself and Alan Davidson, have really created something that needed to happen for a whole variety of reasons amongst a whole lot of denominations. But I'm not thinking of that so much as the secular impact of, for the first time, society, well, maybe not the first time, but for society itself to begin to really take notice of the fact that there's been this religious history that has had a great deal to do with the shaping of the mores and culture of the country over a very long time.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And one of my former students and now very much colleague, John Stenhouse, states this point more strongly than I would state it. And John and I have friendly disputes about this. But how John expresses it is that in a way, the Sinclair tradition of history in New Zealand, like a lot of the arts in New Zealand, has been led by people from a very secular point of view. And so this is the Beaglehole Sinclair approach, in which religion is written out, but the history of the left wing is written up. And while the history of the left wing certainly should be emphasized and has a lot to say, I mean, the history of the left wing itself is laden with religious connections. And discovering that, in fact, early evangelicalism was largely, until it became very sectarian and fundamentalist, largely on the left, because it was effectively, early evangelicalism was Methodist primarily. And Methodism was aiming for the workers and listened to the voice of the left. So, I mean, there's those interesting connections that have been lost because of that American fundamentalist tradition that has just badly distorted the shape of the evangelical movement.
I think that's a really interesting point, and a lot of people don't realize that fundamentalism as a philosophy for the religious right only really came into being in the early part of the 20th century. I think it was 1910 or thereabouts that they published that series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals. And that was the thing that really got the whole Darwinian debate wound up all over again. Whereas I think Dr. Stenhouse really quite conclusively showed that a number of key religious leaders in New Zealand accepted Darwin very readily. And I mean, I went on to develop some of that in the mathematical field as well. But most of what occurs now is a little bit like Donald Trump's alternative truths, that somehow the religious right ignores the facts of our own history. They don't want to know. Fundamentalism in their minds has existed since God delivered the Ten Commandments.
Yes. Yeah. And this distortion of, well, people tell the story as they want to in order to confirm that where they're standing today is right and has always been right. And that's unfortunately the way it's been. But you see, I mean, remember that my background was, even though today I'm a member, simultaneously I might say, of a Baptist, an Anglican, and a gay church, which is pretty wacky, makes my Sundays very busy. The simple fact is that my background has led me to appreciate that small religious movements actually play an unusually influential role in the shaping of the community. And it's very worthwhile watching out for the ways in which people, I mean, I just think Anglicanism in New Zealand history has had a relatively bland contribution to make in the community, and Anglicanism has been predominant in the society. And it's often been the other religious movements who've been able to gather momentum. So I've done studies over the years of the Mormons, the Adventists, the Churches of Christ, Methodism, of course, a lot of studies of Methodism, and I've got a whole stack of material on primitive Methodism I want to work on more when I get some spare moments, on all sorts of other wacky groups like, I better be careful because I mentioned Christian Science in the same breath as wacky movements in a recent broadcast, and it upset the Christian Scientists, who have been very kind to me in supplying material about their history. So, but unusual groups from the fringe have actually made a significant contribution. That's why groups like Destiny, which are loathsome in some respects, we should never downplay the significance that they're having in the Māori community. And that's really what interests me.
Yeah, I mean, I think Destiny is a fascinating case study. No one's highlighted it better than you. You've written extensively about it, and you've also had the unique ability to gain the trust of Brian Tamaki, its leader. I had a prior question that came in before tonight's meeting. Someone was wanting to know whether there was any similarity between the way Destiny structured itself and the way the Open Brethren structured itself, because they thought there must be, because you wrote so convincingly about Destiny, you must have some kind of prior knowledge. Any comment about that, Peter?
No, not at all. I mean, I've never been in the charismatic movement, but I've had a lot of friends who have been Pentecostals or in the charismatic movement, and I've always watched and tried to understand them. And I think a key aspect for any historian, especially of religious movements, is to give some credit to the fact that something motivates these people that shouldn't just be dismissed, even though you might want to set it in the context. And I mean, most famously, I caused some surprise at the Mormon History Conference when I said I can't explain the miracles that persuaded the early Mormons to leave the Church of England and follow the Mormons. But I said something persuaded them to change. And you see, so what I do in many of these cases, I just say, well, I can't put this all together. Because it seems to happen in a wide variety of religious movements, but I just think more happens than my empirical tools enable me to fully explain, and I want to give some credit to that factor, along with this pretty significant credit on a whole heap of church politics that are anything but pure and good and decent. no connection between the brethren and Tamaki, not even remotely. The brethren would be incapable of organizing a big church, really, because they so hate one person running anything.
I think there's probably a lesson in that for the Methodists. Wesley's genius was starting small groups, not mega churches. Though Peter has written again, he's gathered fascinating statistics about the growth of the Pacifica mega churches, particularly the Tongan mega church Methodists, in a relatively small, a couple of square miles over in South Auckland way. And that brings me to the final point I'd like to make for the evening, Peter. The breadth of what you've done viewed by people like myself who've been at the coalface of ministry, Christian ministry, the breadth of what you've done, the intellectual drive that has enabled you to put statistics, to put history, to put story, the story of people in front of us and make it live, I think has been quite outstanding. And the last question I'd want to put to you, has it been easy, given all the things of your brethren background and your identity as a gay person in the community today, has that been an easy journey to take?
Oh, of course not. It's been an extremely, extremely difficult journey, but I've tried to make that journey. I mean, people think I'm mad in this, but I've tried to make that journey with respecting people with whom I really have had to disagree, because I didn't make this journey to hurt others, and I miss everything that I lose, and I feel that loss. In some ways, I'm going to 3 churches because I need 3 churches to make up for the brethren, which is kind of all-consuming. But so it's been important to me, whenever I work with people on their story, to enter that story and both keep a bit of critical distance. I need critical distance, and critical distance can enable you to see through what's going on when you're being kicked out of a church. But critical distance needs to be accompanied with, I don't know what it is, it's a compassion, I think, that enables you to enter their story and allow them to give them credit for, within their own limits, sincerely and earnestly trying to be what they're trying to be. So I want to set them in context, but I don't want to so squeeze them that nothing is left.
Well, I think on behalf of a huge number of people, but I'm particularly talking about the Methodist community and my colleagues, we would want to say a huge affirmation and thank you for the kind of leader, Christian leader that you are. You're primarily an historian, a religious historian who has made a personal story become a kind of inspirational, educational legacy for so many of us. So, Peter, we'll bring our broadcast for this live on air to a close with our huge thanks to you.